Welcome to another philosophical conversation. My name is Cadell Last. I'm here today with Dr. Matthew David Segall. Dr. Segall is an interdisciplinary researcher, writer, teacher, and philosopher, applying process relational thought across the natural and social sciences, as well as to the study of consciousness. He is an associate professor in the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program at the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco, as well as the chair of the Science Advisory Committee for the Cobb Institute. And today I am super excited to discuss his book, Crossing the Threshold, which, as I discovered reading it, was originally the foundation for your dissertation thesis. So maybe we should start there. Where did this idea for crossing the threshold emerge, and how long has this book been in the work? What is the origin of it and the process of its coming to be?
Yeah, happy to start there. And thanks for the invitation to join you to talk about it. So I defended my dissertation in 2016. It had the title Cosmo-theandric Imagination, and I'll unpack that word in a second. Cosmo-theandric Imagination in the Post-Kantian Process Philosophy of Schelling and Whitehead. And the preface, as you'll remember having read it, and anyone who's read it will know, is really jumping off from this idea of the cosmo-theandric experience or principle that Raimundo Panikkar developed. He was a philosopher, theologian, scientist. He had a PhD in chemistry, I believe, and he gave the Gifford lectures in the mid 2000s called The Rhythm of Being. And he was a very influential thinker for me, who brings together metaphysics, ontology, philosophy more generally, science, but also a very experientially grounded sense of religion and spirituality. And I teach in a graduate program where we bring in philosophy, cosmology, consciousness, and so of course a thinker like Panikkar is speaking my language. And so the original idea here was to approach Kant, who famously forbid us knowledge of the soul, forbid us knowledge of the cosmos as a whole, and forbid us any kind of supersensory knowledge, right? And so referencing Panikkar's idea of the cosmo-theandric principle, which is cosmos, God, and human as one integrated kind of trinity. Panikkar suggests that no, actually there are ways to gain real insight into these big ideas, but that we have to do so not just through our cognitive activity, as Kant was pursuing and developing a critique of, but through our hearts. And so that there is, you might refer to this as faith, but faith has this connotation nowadays of belief in some dogma, and that's not what is meant really by faith as a mode of knowing through the heart, which would be more of an opening of oneself to modes of experience of realities that aren't available unless we're willing to participate. Unless we're willing to open ourselves to that possibility, we're not going to have the experience. And that's a very different attitude than the normal Cartesian stance of skepticism, right? And so my whole dissertation and eventually this book was an attempt really to perform an experiment. What if we were to try to cultivate a form of philosophy, a form of a loving approach to wisdom and insight into the nature of reality that didn't just engage thinking, but also feeling and willing? It's not that I'm not doing a lot of thinking in this book, but I'm trying to bring thinking back into contact with these other modes of human being and cosmic being. And so that's kind of the inspiration for the project. I don't think there were many other philosophy departments where I would have been allowed to engage a project like this. And yeah, having defended it in 2016, I kind of sat on it for a while and, writing a dissertation can be such a difficult process, and you're rereading the same sentences and paragraphs over and over and over again, and you're getting feedback. It's torn apart. You have to go back to the drawing board and do it again. And so I needed to let it sit for several years, but I did go back and revise it pretty thoroughly, reordered some chapters, added a few new citations from relevant books and articles that had been published in the meantime, and then just recently republished this as a book and changed the title. Cosmo-theandric was a bit of a mouthful. I didn't think it would leap off the shelves, so I changed it to something a little bit more alluring and just interesting, like crossing the threshold. Everyone wants to do that or know what that means. So, but yeah, it's a difficult work of philosophical experimentation, and I'm drawing on Whitehead and Schelling, who are, I think, neglected figures in the history of philosophy, at least until quite recently. I think there's a bit of a renaissance happening for both of them, probably for similar reasons that maybe we could get into, but I'll pause here and see where we want to go next.
I love all that. And one of the reasons that I resonate with your story in particular is because you had the opportunity to do a dissertation in a program which is quite unique in philosophy and in academia as a whole. I mean, I myself had the opportunity to do a dissertation in a very weird interdisciplinary group, and I felt like this was a tremendous privilege and a tremendous honor to be able to explore something in such an interdisciplinary way at such an early age. And judging from where you're working now at the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program, I hope that many more people will get a chance to engage interdisciplinary thought in their dissertation at that level. I also love this trinity that you're working with. It resonates with me, although cosmo-theandric is a mouthful. Just thinking about this relationship between cosmos, God, and human is fascinating. The first question that actually came to my mind was in regards to faith, from what you were just saying, as in terms of most people would relate it to belief in some dogma. And the question I wanted to throw out was in relationship to this book being, well, it says in the subtitle, a post-Kantian process philosophy. And Kant, in some sense, in the Critique of Pure Reason, opening up, at least traditionally speaking, room for faith. And so where do you think faith in your understanding and in this book sort of differs or takes a divergence, or does it, from what Kant is trying to do there? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think Kant's project, as he seems to have understood it, his later critical project, I mean, he was quite a impressive sort of speculative cosmologist for much of his life. But when he sat down towards the end of his life to write the three critiques, his project seems to have been to not to deny the possibility of metaphysics, but to approach it in a scientific way after having performed a thorough critique of our instrument of knowing. And sometimes he's interpreted as having just forbid knowledge of reality beyond appearances. And I think that's not so accurate. It's clear, though, he didn't finally succeed in achieving what he set out to do. It took, I think, the German idealists who philosophized in his wake, Fichte, Schelling, Hegel in particular, to really bring the Kantian project to more completion, though I don't know that their project was finally completed either. But to say that my work here is post-Kantian is to inherit a lot from Kant, a deep appreciation for what he attempted to do, but also to point out the places where I think he made some wrong turns. Now, as you're hinting, he does say he's leaving room for faith. I think specifically what he says in the intro or the preface to the Critique of Pure Reason is something like, I found it necessary to limit knowledge in order to leave room for faith. And I think he means faith and freedom in particular. The Critique of Practical Reason after the Critique of Pure Reason was an attempt to really understand this feeling of freedom that we have, that in some sense we can't actually understand how it could be compatible with our knowledge of nature, which for Kant was typified by Newtonian physics and this sense of determinism, whereas we have this inner experience of freedom. And Kant realized that both of these, from his point of view, were impossible to do without, or to deny. And I think all I'm trying to do in this book is to say that, look, it's through our experience of freedom that we can actually gain some knowledge of nature, that there's something about this inner experience in our own thinking activity, in our own sense that we have will, that, we say free will, which makes it sound like just this total libertarian break from all causal continuity. We don't necessarily need to imply that when we say freedom, but we do experience this ability to, we have agency, and we feel bad. We have this conscience. If we do something wrong, we feel bad, like we could have done otherwise, and so that phenomenological reality, I think, rather than accepting this Cartesian dualism where anything we think and feel within ourselves must be cut off from and totally separate from whatever's going on out there with the motion of matter, I think where I really draw on Whitehead and Schelling is actually to insist on more of an analogy here between our inner life as human beings and the outward motions of natural phenomena, that there is actually an interior to nature, and that it is something like the human interior, right? And so what human beings experience as freedom is the same inner activity at work in nature. Whitehead calls it creativity. And so I think the road through Kant is to really expand on his insights into the nature of freedom, to show how we can have more than a merely apparent knowledge of nature, that we actually in ourselves experience this interiority of nature, and that out of that analogy, that connection, a whole new cosmology can be articulated. And Whitehead and Schelling do most of the work for me here. I'm just in this text really trying to show the connection to Kant's project and to invite people into an experience of what this new Whiteheadian, Schellingian conception of the human universe relationship, what it feels like, what is its phenomenology, what is its what are its implications for our sense of meaning and purpose in life, and also I try to end with some application to society and culture at large. But there's a whole new methodology implicit in this, which has scientific relevance, I think, but also relevance for religious studies and the study of religious experience, and I think can help us have a new kind of conversation about the relationship between science and religion. That's just a bit about the relationship to Kant and his project.
Yeah, no, that's very clear. And in that sense, when you're saying the Kantian project, and immediately leading to Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, in some sense, you're picking up that project in the same time, drawing on Schelling as part of that lineage, and at the same time, sort of emphasizing, earlier that for whatever reason, Schelling has been neglected until recently, and Whitehead as well. And I have to admit that in my sort of readings and my studies in philosophy, not say I neglected them, but they definitely haven't been my focus. So in that context, why do you think Schelling and Whitehead have been neglected? And what is the renaissance that you think is happening? What do you see? And maybe what are the reasons for maybe more scholars drawing on them as inspirations?
So in his own time, Schelling developed this philosophy of nature, which was quite popular. It was controversial then too, but there were a number of followers of Schelling's, particularly among biologists and physiologists, doctors, and so on. And later in the 19th century, there was a shift which occurred that I think has complicated causes, economic changes. In just this industrialization reached Germany in a big way, and there was just the introduction of a more practically minded, mechanistic mode of thought that was judging the success of a theory or hypothesis based on its technological application, basically. Like, what can you do with this? And the Schellingian understanding of nature, very similar to like Goethe's understanding of nature, was a more contemplative, participatory understanding, where it was less about how can I know nature so as to transform it, and instead was more about how can I get to know myself by knowing nature? How can I understand more deeply the ways in which my own inner capacities are a mirror image of the forms that I can observe metamorphosing in the natural world, right? And so there's this more contemplative aspect or emphasis, rather, in the Schellingian and the Goethean scientific method, which isn't as much so much predisposed to giving you new techniques for melting and mixing metals, or building complicated gearworks, or catapults and ballistics and all these things that, or steam engines, of course, and all of this stuff that in the mid 1800s really became the goal of scientific thinking. It became technoscience, and that trend has only been massively accelerated in the last 150 years or so, into the 20th and 21st centuries. Science is technoscience now. Science is not this contemplative understanding so much. But because of the ecological consequences and also the social consequences of this technoscientific mode of thought and the industrial transformation of the planet, it's very clear now that I think most thinking people are aware of the downside of this approach. It turns out that imagining nature as a machine ends up doing great damage. I mean, imagining the Earth as a kind of complicated machine composed of just raw materials that we can exploit and extract energy from so as to produce products for our economies. That whole enterprise has led us into an ecological catastrophe, and it's not clear that we're going to be able to pull ourselves out of a process which appears almost to have its own logic. This giant machine we've built around ourselves appears to have its own logic and is self-perpetuating now. But people who are looking at this history and the ways that our understanding of nature have evolved over the centuries are beginning to realize that Goethe and Schelling articulated, you could almost call it an alternative scientific method, and an alternative form of modern science that would have potentially allowed us to have the kind of sensitivities to the organic world that would have prevented us from marching ourselves headlong off a cliff. And so because of the ecological crisis, I think Schelling and Whitehead, who also developed a very organic mode of thinking, a lot of people are returning to their thought in search of an ecological ethics and in search of a new way of doing science that isn't dualistic, as much as contemporary scientists who are caught up in this techno industrial mode of production, would say that, of course, they reject Cartesian dualism. The mind is the body or whatever. Still, they're performing that dualism in their way of producing abstractions about nature, as though they were observing it from the outside rather than as themselves a product of nature. Truly, to imagine the human being, including everything we experience, as a product of nature, that revolutionizes our whole picture of what the universe is, if we really overcome Cartesian dualism. So there's all this still implicit residue of Cartesianism in so much of modern technoscience. So Schelling and Whitehead help us overcome that. I see Whitehead as a 20th century update of Schelling's science. When Schelling was developing his philosophy of nature in the late 1790s and early 1800s, he was drawing on these new sciences at the time, of electricity and magnetism and chemistry and geology and the sense of the deep history of the earth and all of this. So they were, those were the new paradigm sciences of his day, and he was doing his best to understand them in an organic way. Whitehead does the same thing with relativity and quantum theories in the early 20th century, when it became very clear to the physicists who were making those discoveries, particularly the quantum physicists, that nature could not be understood as a collection of particles colliding with each other in empty space through homogeneous time. There was clearly a deeper entanglement, a deeper sense of creative process that could not be understood mechanistically. And Whitehead was hip to this and developed a new metaphysics for science that hasn't caught on until recently, because for many decades physicists were taught to just shut up and calculate and don't ask the metaphysical questions because it was too weird. If your common sense was basically Cartesian and mechanistic, it was just too weird. But because there's just been so little progress in a century understanding how to interpret quantum theory, if there even is a quantum theory, it's more like a recipe for producing predictions. Because there's been so little progress, I think people are finally starting to, scratch their heads and look back at the origins of quantum mechanics, and to take seriously what scientists, going back to Max Planck, who was something of a mystical idealist when he tried to understand the implications of his physics, and then of course Bohr and Schrödinger and Heisenberg, and Whitehead, I think, should be included among these thinkers. He wasn't as much a pioneer in quantum physics as he was deeply engaged in conversation with Einstein about relativity physics, but he understood the implications of quantum phenomena and really did develop a metaphysical scheme and a cosmological picture whereby we could integrate these new findings. And so, yeah, for all these reasons, Whitehead and Schelling are being taken up again seriously to try to sort of patch the world back together again after a century and a half or so of a major wrong turn, I think.
Yeah, it's a serious issue, and the thing that perhaps strikes me the strongest is the difference between scientists who say, of course we reject Cartesian dualism, but then engage in performative contradiction with the type of work that they're doing or the type of science that they're doing. And so there's this way in which we have this, I'm not sure if it's a default to disembodied mode of thinking, but we have this tendency to view nature as if we're from the outside, as it were, as opposed to from the inside. And this distinction seems to also go to the heart of the philosophical distinction you're trying to make, which I think we should labor on a little bit, just to make sure that the viewers sort of understand what's going on here. I think at the core of your book, and even at the core of like this philosophical tension, with Kant's schism, between the phenomenal world and the thing in itself, and then, what you call in the book, the inversion of Kant, or, I think, just quoting you here from the book, I thought it was really well stated. And this metaphor also comes up throughout the book a lot. Quote, the inversion of Kant involves a replanting of cognition in the aesthetic processes that power it. And here the metaphor that I think shows up throughout the book is this idea of planting, as I think what you'll develop as a vegetal ontology. But that's maybe getting a little too far ahead of ourselves. Maybe let's just stay with this super important schism which Kant opens up and which has been so, debated, discussed throughout the history of modern philosophy, of the phenomenal world versus the thing in itself. What's going on here? And then what do you mean by the inversion of this relationship?
Yeah, so, Kant famously limited our knowledge of nature to phenomena, to appearances, and was suggesting that his new critical form of philosophy is a kind of Copernican revolution in philosophy, in the sense that it puts the human subject back at the center of the process of knowing, so that rather than thinking of the subject conforming to objects and coming to know by that process of confirmation, Kant inverts that and says that no, the objects must conform to the structure and activity of the subject. So the way that the subject knows actually is constructing the form that the objects take. And so our knowledge of natural phenomena is a function of these forms of intuition called space and time. For Kant, these are forms of our own intuition. They're not out there that we come to know through empirical generalization or something from particular experiences. He says, no, they're a priori. And he tries to prove this by talking about geometry and arithmetic and the synthetic a priori knowledge, as he referred to it, that mathematics gives us. So we can count, we can do arithmetic, because that's basically the structure of our inner intuition, of temporal intuition. And we can do geometry because that's the structure of our outer intuition. And all of our mathematical knowledge of nature then is more a function of our mind's way of filtering sensation than it is about discovering something out there. And in addition to these forms of intuition, right, we have these categories of understanding, which again for Kant are a priori. They come pre-installed, as I like to say, as this operating system in terms of which we interpret the world. And in many ways, he's just lifting Aristotle's categories. And there's, things like substance and different modes of relation. And when you break down all of the propositions we can form about the world, you're left with these sort of elements, right? And these are what he meant by the categories. And by limiting knowledge to phenomena, Kant is not saying that our knowledge is therefore just sort of totally contingent and merely subjective. He says, no, these categories and these forms of intuition are the universal and necessary way that all human beings are going to interpret their experience. So he's preserving what you need for science, which is universality and necessity. But he's construing that universality and necessity in a way that it only applies to phenomena. And so it creates this sense of a veil around human experience, beyond which are these things in themselves, which he marks with a mere X in the Critique of Pure Reason. And it's this division, it's an epistemological dualism rather than an ontological dualism, you might say. But it leaves Kant in a rather precarious situation, because he ends up having to say that our sensory experience is caused by the things in themselves, or the noumena, And the problem with that statement is that he's applying a category, causality, which elsewhere he says is only meant to apply to phenomena. He's applying it to something noumenal. So it's a self contradiction, and Fichte exploits this in his idealism. Fichte felt he was just carrying forward the spirit of Kant's own philosophy, but Fichte carries this forward and says, look, Kant tried to avoid this implication, but he wasn't being true to the spirit of his own thinking. We can just get rid of that X beyond our experience, or we could recognize something that Kant also indicates, that the subject, the thinking self, is just as noumenal for Kant as the things in themselves that he says, are the cause of our sense experience. So there's an outer noumenon and an inner noumenon. And Kant even hints at some point in the Critique of Judgment that these two might be connected through some mysterious supersensible substratum, I think he refers to it as. But Fichte basically says, look, we have this inner experience of thinking, of being an I, of the ego, and that this is the first principle of all philosophy for Fichte, this thinking activity. And this is not the kind of activity that we could ever objectify and know, because whenever we engage in the activity of thinking and try to reflect on that very activity, we're only sort of seeing the wake of the activity. And Fichte has all of these brilliant lectures, where he's trying to direct his students' attention to the very act of reflection itself, which cannot be captured by reflection. So he'll say to his students, stare at the wall. Now, look at yourself looking at the wall. Who is now doing the looking? He would ask. And what you discover in that type of meditation is this infinite regress. And what Fichte wants to say is that this thinking activity that we can't quite capture, but that we know that we are, or that we are performing, is itself the source of this illusion of a thing in itself out there. And that really it is this thinking activity that in order to capture itself or catch itself in the act, produces what Fichte calls the not I, which would be a check on that activity that is itself what provides for our capacity for reflection. And that any objects we encounter in the world are actually produced by, and Kant was already kind of saying this, Fichte is just getting rid of the phenomenal noumenal division and saying that no, the world, reality really is produced by our thinking activity. And our own thinking activity produces a check upon itself in order to give rise to this world of appearances. But that we can actually do this, in a way, it's a kind of phenomenological reduction before Husserl named it as such, where we can return to that activity to understand the source of all of space and time and the entirety of the physical universe. And so Fichte becomes a really radical idealist in an attempt to overcome this noumena division in Kant. And then you get the counter by Fichte's student initially, you could say, Schelling, who says, well, wait a minute now, you can't just say that all of living nature is a mere projection of the I. Nature has its own interiority and its own creative core. And so Schelling says we could just as easily flip it, and say that our human self-consciousness and thinking activity is an intensification of something that nature has always been doing. Right? And so with Kant, and then the initial reaction to Kant in Fichte and Schelling, reaction, but also, they're carrying forward a Kantian impulse, I would say, but they're honing it, they're perfecting it. We can see this deepening of human self-consciousness and our relationship to the rest of the cosmos. And whether or not the phenomenal noumenal division is overcome as a result of what Fichte and Schelling accomplished is a conversation we could have, but there's a sense in which the Kantian position was a kind of compromise. It was unstable. Kant just kind of, I think he recognized the problem, but he became a little bit too old and lost his mental capacities in order to really follow it through himself. And he didn't like the direction that Fichte and Schelling took his work. Especially if, he liked Fichte initially, but then was less happy with how extreme his idealism became. Kant didn't want to be known as an idealist who thought that the world was just created by the mind. So yeah, that's part of the difficulty Kant left us in, and the initial reactions to it.
I think that was a brilliant explication of the history of German idealism. So anyone who wants to really get to those core distinctions, I suggest press rewind and study what you were just saying there in great detail. I found that to be very very well said. So in this inversion of Kant, which you just articulated as it regards to Schelling, where does Whitehead fit into that? Is he just picking up from Schelling? Is Whitehead having studied Schelling, then coming to same conclusions, or did he derive this result through a different pathway?
Whitehead was aware of Schelling's work, and he quotes Schelling once in his 1920 book, The Concept of Nature, but he didn't study Schelling directly or in much depth. And so while I have tried to argue that there's a conceptual convergence between these thinkers, it's not a very strong historical connection. Whitehead read a book by a Russian philosopher named Losky about Schelling. And he was friends with many British idealists who drunk deeply from more so the Hegelian well, but there's no Hegel without Schelling. And so Whitehead was steeped in these sorts of ideas, but not directly self-consciously inheriting Schelling's project. But there are so many similarities and convergences in their thinking. And so one of the ways Whitehead inverts Kant is by generalizing this relationship that for Kant was still too specialized, which is to say that Kant really tried to understand the relationship between cognition and the world, and discovered the intimate relationship between the two. And Whitehead wants to generalize beyond just the human subject many of the insights that Kant limited to the human subject and to the nature of human cognition. So this is part of Whitehead's panexperientialism, as it has come to be called. Whitehead didn't use that phrase. David Ray Griffin, a process philosopher and theologian, coined it to distinguish what Whitehead's doing from panpsychism. There's a whole other conversation there. But Whitehead's panexperientialism is basically saying, look, there's nothing ultimately unique about the human subject. The human subject is one example of subjectivity, and that every, what he would call actual entity in the cosmos, has a subject pole and is engaged in this constructive activity whereby a kind of objective world is brought forth. But now there's the inversion here is that, Kant would insist that the objective world is brought forth out of the subject. And Whitehead's not completely denying that. He's just saying it's also just as true to say that the subject is an outgrowth of the objective world. And so Whitehead has an account of what he calls concrescence, which is a generalization of what Kant is describing just in terms of the constructive activity of the human subject, so that it now applies to subjects at all scales in nature. So for Whitehead, part of what panexperientialism entails is that every actual entity, from the quantum up to the galactic and beyond, of whatever scale, is this process of experience whereby the past grows together to form a new moment of experience in the present, which then launches itself into the future. And he's bringing together so much of what remains fragmented in Kant. So he wants to be able to think um, our theoretical experience and our practical experience as part of the same process, so that the way that we know the world from moment to moment is continuous with the way that we strive to affect the future from moment to moment, right? And so, for Kant, a merely apparent world is produced by a subject, and it's a form of subjectivity that belongs only to human beings. Whereas for Whitehead, a real world of objects grows together to form a new subject, which then itself, having achieved its new perspective on the world, perishes to become an object again that will affect the future, because it will be inherited by the next moment of concrescence. And it's a very difficult vision to get your to get a handle on initially, because it's so dramatically different from the very anthropocentric view that modern Western philosophers have had, because it's decentering the human subject while at the same time centering subjectivity as such in a more generic sense. So yeah, how is that landing? I know I've introduced a very new idea here.
Well, I think it's the central idea in terms of what I've been researching, and in sort of like my discussions at the intersection of Whitehead and idealism, is but what the way you framed it was very interesting to me. So I think the core idea is the way you're emphasizing that the subject is an outgrowth of the objective world, and that there's sort of this polarized relationship between the subject and the object. How can we think this both at the same time? Can we think that the objective world is an outgrowth of the subject, while also thinking the inverse, that the subject is an outgrowth of the objective? Do you see what or is there a one-sidedness to this thinking, or can we think? That's what I'm trying to get at. Is there? How do we think this together?
Yeah, Whitehead's really trying to avoid idealism here, where we would just say that the objective world is a projection or a construct of the subject. But he's also not denying that that's half true. So think of the entirety of the cosmos as this ongoing process that's omnicentric in a way, and each of these centers is an actual occasion of experience, and the world is being reborn in each of these centers of experience again and again and again. And so it's a kind of pluralism. It's like a Leibnizian monadology in a way, with the important difference that Whitehead's monads, or actual occasions, are not closed to relations with one another. Leibniz's monads were windowless, he says. And so he needed this elaborate machinery of pre-established harmony to explain how they all appear to relate so in such an orchestrated way to one another, despite the fact that there's no real causal connection between any of them. Whitehead's monads, or actual occasions, are all internally related to one another, which is to say, each new moment of experience, as it grows out of the past, is inheriting the entirety of the past, achieving a new subjective perspective upon that past, which then itself perishes to become part of the world, but the world increased by itself, by its new perspective that it is achieved, and then that will be inherited by the next moment of experience. And so the whole of the cosmos is this, it's the best analogy I can think of is that it's like a process of embryogenesis, where you have a kind of cellular division occurring, but you have to temporalize the vision a little bit. Don't just think of it as an embryo growing bigger and bigger, but as a process, a developmental process, whereby the universe is always growing at the edges through new the formation of new cells, which incorporate everything that came before. And so, one of the things that happens here, one of the inversions, is in regards to understanding of space and time, rather than thinking of this process of cellular growth occurring in an already formed space. Whitehead would say, no, space and time are actually brought forth out of the relationships between these cells or these actual occasions of experience. And so space and time are actually quite abstract relative to our experience. They're not containers. They are abstract modes of describing the relationship among actual occasions of experience. And so instead of feeling the way that, so much of modern science has taught us to feel as little sort of small specks of dust in this giant empty expanse of space, the Whiteheadian point of view would be not to put human beings at the center in any ways, but to say that way of imagining space is a figment of our imaginations. We're not in space. Space is brought forth by the activity of all of these experiential centers inheriting from one another and launching themselves into the future. And so in a way, I don't know, it allows us to breathe again, I would say, and allows us to not feel so minuscule. And the idea of a materialistic view of the cosmos, it makes it seem like the immensity of space is a diminishment of the meaning that we might be able to make as human beings. And I think with this inversion, we're not trapped inside this gigantic terrarium or something. It affords us a different relationship to the vastness of the cosmos, but it's a vastness that we are participating in creating in a way.
Yeah.
So this is where the science and the spirituality begin to overlap, I think.
Right. Yeah. There's a lot there, and I have to say that this resonates with my phenomenological experience of coming to be a scientist, in the sense that when I was a young teen, early 20s, learning about astronomy, learning about cosmology, you do have this experience of being very small, and the universe being very vast. But then over time, sort of, I guess, in my own sort of process of discovery, coming to sort of see that, scale is in some sense overrated. Like the idea of scale is overrated, like that it seems like what you're saying is that Whitehead's process philosophy sort of gives us a justification for reframing the human being in relationship to the discovery over the last 2 centuries of just how vast the universe is, and in some sense bringing us back to a point of view that allows us to, would you say, feel at home? Does it make sense to say that, or how would you frame it? I know that's where we get to spiritual. That's where we get to spiritual topics.
I wouldn't want to get too sentimental about it, because there's plenty that's very weird about the universe, and there's a sense in which the Earth is a planet, meaning the Earth is wandering, the Earth is in motion, and so you could say this allows us to feel more at home. But a process philosophy, it can also disturb our sense of comfort in a way. Because it's throwing everything into motion, and it's suggesting that in every moment of our experience we are creating ourselves anew, and there's continuity with the past because we're inheriting the past, but we're participants in a process of continuous creation. And unlike, say, standard Big Bang cosmology, where there was one singularity that 13.8 billion years ago gave rise to space, time, matter, and energy, and then it's like a once and done thing. No, it's like the Big Bang is still banging, it's still happening, and there's nowhere to drop anchor and establish stasis, or there's no there's no home in that sense where we could just feel safe and tucked in.
not home, and not home in terms of staticness or fixedness, but home, I think, in terms of proportion. Like like
Right.
where like the or like you're emphasizing, if we are, instead of being, like you were saying, specks of dust in a big cosmos, whatever, that we're participants in a continuous creation, then like what I've always said spontaneously is, because I've sort of been unrooted from my birthplace for several years now, that my home is where my creation is. That's what
Mm,
so, and that
I
that
like
seems
that.
to be what you're saying in some sense,
Yeah.
or yeah, in some
Yeah. And like, so
senses.
we're at home here in the sense that it's not to deny the vastness of the universe, but to say, look, that vastness is inside of us as well.
Yeah.
We're like that.
Hmm.
And so we're not out of place in that sense. Yeah.
I think that's maybe better than home, that we're not out of place. um yeah, okay, that makes sense. And yeah, I've always resonated with that aspect, not only of Whitehead but other thinkers that you engage with in this book, like Bergson and Deleuze, sort of emphasizing the creative aspect, the creative evolutionary aspect, and sort of centering, in some sense, the creativity. Does it make sense? Because that's another big theme that I recently was teaching on. Of course, with modern knowledge, I feel like we're dealing with a process of repeated decenterings. Decentered from the solar system, decentered from life, decentered from
Mhm.
consciousness.
Mhm.
Uh, does creation, in some sense, bring us to a new center? How do you think about that?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's both a way in which we need to decenter the human being and a way in which I think the anthropos needs to be recognized as central. And so, what needs to be decentered would be the idea that our particular species of animal on the earth is mm, entitled to more habitat, more energy use, more etc. And other species don't matter, or that we're just competing with them anyway, so why not dominate? That view of the Homo sapiens as the apex predator or whatever, I think that's bullshit. And we need, if we hope to continue to inhabit the planet um, in a way that's enduring for more than another century or so on the current trajectory, then we need to totally upend that sort of view. But at a deeper level, when we're talking about the anthropos and the way in which what our species um, is an attempt to exemplify, I think all species of life are an attempt to exemplify this anthropos more as like an ideal or an archetype, if you want. And while our particular species is not identical with that archetype, because any physical being can only exemplify archetypes, I think we're nonetheless a kind of representative on the planet of that archetype. And so what I would want to avoid in the rush to decenter our species is that we fail to take responsibility for the realization of this anthropic principle, if you want, which I think has something to do with the curvature of cosmic evolution towards beings capable of more wisdom and compassion. And that's a kind of ideal for the direction that human evolution could move in, that I would want to hold out hope for. And I think as we engage with the ecological crisis, I don't want us to just say, oh, it'd be better if humans went extinct. It's like, no, no, no. There's an important evolutionary role that human beings can play on the earth, which is to realize this ideal of wisdom and compassion, and then to, having realized that, become earthlings, fully earthlings, who can tend this to this community of life. recognizing that whatever the human is, like the human body is not just the skin barrier of our particular species. The human body is the earth as a whole, including all of the other organisms which compose it. And so everything is human in a way. Right. And so this is a deeper kind of anthropocentrism, right? Which, and it's not to say that I don't also agree with the need to decenter a smaller sense of what the human means, but I think there's a deeper sense that we need to retain, actually. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, and I feel like you're articulating something which I've rarely heard articulated, or not articulated in that precisely that way before, specifically as it relates to, usually you'll get people who have sort of like an explicitly anthropocentric point of view, or people who are trying to combat an anthropocentric point of view. But it seems like you're trying, like I would use the language like you're trying to sublate anthropocentrism, like you're trying to cancel it and lift it at the same time, to bring it to a higher concept of anthropocentrism than
Exactly.
we usually use it in discourse. And perhaps it's really another thing I liked about what you were saying was just the language of talking about something to do with the curvature of cosmic evolution. I think like bringing sort of the language of general relativity into a cosmic evolutionary frame, and precisely in relationship to, I might build a little bit and say like the gravitational attraction of certain qualities like compassion, that this in some sense is, we need, the problem to me at this level is that we only have one example of the human species. Like my first thought experiment when I was just starting thinking deeply was the ultimate scientific imagination would be if we could have like 50 or 100 different examples of intelligent technological life, and like then we could do like a real analysis, like is there really like some sort of curvature and gravitation towards higher compassion over evolutionary time. And this is just the dream, I guess, of nerds, but but it would be a really really fun way to get at some impossible problems and questions on the scale of cosmic evolution.
Absolutely. I mean, whether or not the physics, that at least our understanding of physics would allow for us to contact intelligent beings from other planets, just given, again, the vastness of space. If we were to try to travel in a rocket from planet to planet in different solar systems, I mean, it takes so long. But if we were to be able to in some way gain knowledge of intelligent species on other planets, then I think we'd begin very quickly to intuit more clearly what this anthropos archetype I'm talking about is, which would be the strange attractor, or just the attractor that is shaping evolution in a way. It's a kind of teleology, but both Schelling and Whitehead are introducing teleology back into science, but doing so in a way that's not the transcendent imposition of a kind of deistic design, which frankly is what all the early modern scientists were imagining. It's more mechanistic teleology where the designer was God. And this is another aspect of the residual Cartesianism in so much contemporary science, to the extent that you're still talking about laws of physics that are eternal. Where did those come from? Is there a physical process that explains where a law that's and the fine tuning of the fundamental constants and such, where that derives from? You have to get theological at that point. And so, once if we do discover intelligent life on other planets, even if it's through spectral analysis, and we can somehow, derive the fact that though there must be a technological species that's manipulating their atmosphere in order for that spectral reading to be possible, we'll begin to start to learn more about how the empirically observable species on this planet and other planets are approximations to this archetype of the anthropos. There's another point I wanted to make in response to what you said, but I lost it. So if you want to take us in another direction.
Well, I'm just enjoying sort of how I interpret you reinventing the concept of the anthropos.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just enjoying it because it seems like what you're getting at, what you're I think successfully articulating, is something which rings to me something I would call is like the proper way to think the human phenomenon given our knowledge and the theory of cosmic evolution, right? Like it's at least a hypothesis or a tentative conceptualization that then would just simply needed to be tested against whatever we discover about the universe in the future and the possibilities of intelligent life in the future. But it gives me anyway a nice framing for how we might develop speculations, given that we have a lack of evidence at the current moment of
Yeah.
where we are. But
I mean,
also, I like, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
well, just to say, this is another way of understanding the inversion that Schelling and Whitehead achieve over the Kantian perspective, which, Kant's question was basically, what is the human mind such that nature could appear to it in the way that it does? And Schelling inverts that picture and says, what is nature such that mind could have emerged from it? And so the question is, it's still a transcendental question about the conditions of the possibility of something, but it's asking, accepting that we have scientific knowledge. It's not complete knowledge, but we have a lot of scientific understanding of the way that the world works. What are the cosmological conditions of the possibility of science? In other words, what must the universe be like such that it has created human beings, scientists, capable of knowing about that universe? Very important question to ask. And if your metaphysics and ontology, your cosmology, is of the mechanistic variety, of the reductionistic variety that basically thinks of mind as an excretion of the brain or something merely epiphenomenal, contingently evolved as a survival mechanism that because it enhanced survival in some ways, is that a basis for the very knowledge claims that you're making? It would seem to undermine the epistemological foundations of the scientific enterprise to describe the universe in that way. So we need to understand the universe in such a way that it makes possible our very knowledge of it. I think it's a reasonable question to ask, and I think it constrains the types of explanations we can offer.
It seems to me like I always interpreted the importance of the Kantian break in philosophy as related to this, basically shifting questions in relationship to the transcendental a priori, like that we think more in terms of conditions of possibility than sort of just accepting the way things appear in terms of like the givenness of external reality. Mm-hmm. And then, like you get these fun questions like you were saying, where do the physical laws come from? Or why are the physical laws the way they are? And many physicists in speculative circles do take on, like what are the rate, like, and even like I think someone like Stephen Wolfram's taking that on in mathematics, like what is the space, what is the condition of possibility of possible mathematics, like, and even uses vegetal metaphor. He uses vegetal metaphor for the growth of mathematics. Like you could have a certain and he talks about like axioms as seeds. Mm-hmm. And you could grow different mathematics. Like you plant this, like Newton. So like in this way of thinking, like Newton planted a seed and grew that, but we could, but then we haven't, but then we get attached to that plant. And then we're like, but then we don't realize, oh, there's other plants that we could grow. Or this is like the way of thinking that And
Yeah.
it seems very, maybe that's why not just bring up that connection. It seems very relevant to your metaphysics, because you developed more towards the end of the book, but we can just discuss it now. The idea of a vegetal ontology, and so maybe we could discuss like sort of what's going on there, and I'll make the connection from an earlier part of the book first, that it seems like the stakes here in relationship to your framing between Schelling and Descartes is
Mm-hmm.
like, since Descartes, metaphysics or philosophy lacked a living ground.
Mm-hmm.
And so like basically the stakes are thinking from within a living ground.
Exactly. And, this idea for developing a vegetal ontology came from a number of different places all at once. There's a lot of great work recently by Michael Marder on vegetal philosophy. He's written a number of books, The Philosopher's Plant, and others, where he's looking at the history of philosophy going back to Plato and the various inflection points when, whether it's Plato or Aristotle or modern philosophers like Hegel, when they try to understand the place of the plant realm in relationship to animals and humans and the material world, there's a dilemma that arises. It's like, well, are plants alive or not? Do they have souls or not? Soul is usually thought of as a principle of motion, going back to Aristotle and Plato. And plants don't seem to move, at least not as much as animals do. I mean, now that we have time-lapse photography, that's quite obviously we've seen that they obviously do move quite a bit. And so it's a matter of the tempo of your perception. And Martyr's point is that, look, plants and botany nowadays, and all these new experiments are bearing this out. They're they're not only alive, they're cognitive. They're sentient. They experience the world. They have memory. They learn. They seem responsive even to human emotion. And I don't want to go too out into the fringes of some of these experiments, but I continue to be shocked and surprised by the sensitivity of plants, and to what extent the outer fringes of some of the claims made about plants is true. I mean, we'll see, but already the stuff that's well established is remarkable.
I just mind if I jump just and I'll just
Sure.
quickly turn it into a question, but I was wondering if you've read the work of Evan Thompson and his book Mind and Life.
Oh yeah, for sure.
So just this idea that mind and life are like, and then that's like that's what I would just sort of want to get your perspective on, is this relationship between mind and life, and like the consequences of mind and life being more unified than we typically think would lead to the result of what you're saying, that but it's hard for us, like there's a shock, like you're saying, about plants are not only alive but cognitive, right? Like I remember thinking that about cells when I was reading Evan Thompson's book. I was like, thinking about a cell as not only alive but cognitive, and
Yeah.
sort of maybe get your thoughts on this.
Yeah, no, Thompson's book, Mind and Life, is very important for me in thinking about how to engage in a philosophy of nature in a way that's, in Whitehead's terms, not bifurcated anymore. And so Thompson and his teacher Francesco Varela wanted to develop a phenomenological approach to the study of nature. When it's the brain that's being studied, it's called neurophenomenology. I guess I could come up with a kind of vegetal phenomenology, which is in a way what I'm trying to do in one of the later chapters in this book. But in addition to Martyr, and definitely Thompson's in the background here, and the mind-life continuity thesis, I think he calls it, there was also this interesting moment in David Hume's dialogues on natural religion, when Cleanthes and Philo and some other dialogue partner were talking about, well, what is the large-scale structure of the universe really like? Is the universe like an animal? And that's kind of dismissed as a little bit, that's going overboard, because like, what does it eat? There's nothing outside the universe for it to eat, and animals have limbs and they move around and stuff. Like, where is the universe moving? Like, that analogy doesn't really work. But the analogy of the plant or giant vegetable is thrown out as a kind of joke almost. But it seems to be, I don't know if Hume meant it to be taken seriously or what, but it seems to me to be a more adequate metaphor for the kind of life that inheres in the universe at large. The universe is more like a plant. Saying the universe is an animal, I think, lends itself towards a bit more incredulity, just, for all the reasons I just mentioned. But to give it a slightly less fully developed kind of life, like plant life, I think is more palatable, perhaps. And I really just try to develop that analogy and to understand our own thinking activity as plant-like, in the way that as we elaborate a thought or an image, that process is very much a process of growth, and that our own imaginative freedom meets itself externalized in the metamorphosis of plants, and that process of formation that we can observe in the vegetal world around us. And it's just as evident in the morphology of animals, of course. And here, Goethe's work on plant metamorphosis and bone morphology is really important. It allows us to establish this continuity between mind and life, between our own inner experience of imagination and the outer formation of the organic world. And I think implicit in all of this, it's a seed, again, for a totally new approach to science that doesn't either implicitly or explicitly assume a Cartesian divide, as though mind were outside nature looking in. And to the extent that nature is imagined as a mere machine and mind is imagined as this external observer upon that machine, we're not only are we not going to feel at home here, but we're going to have a merely external view of something that also has an inside. And if we can't include the contributions at the causal level of that interiority, then we're only going to be understanding nature in terms of finished form, and we're going to lack an understanding of nature as a process of formation. And we can understand the mineral world, the inorganic physical world, decently well, just as a bunch of finished forms. That's why math works so well in physics. But to try to understand the living world, whether single cells or plants or animals or human beings, just as a collection of finished forms obeying fixed laws, doesn't work. So until we can cultivate this other way of knowing and see how we can participate in the formative process, I think we're going to be locked into a very limited form of science. That's not only limited in the sense of not letting us fully understand how nature works, but it's limited in the sense that through its technological applications, we're actually destroying the world. So it has theoretical and practical consequences.
Right, theory and praxis, and the unity between them, and that brings us back to that. I mean, what you already mentioned, and that the paradox of, even if a scientist says they don't believe in Cartesian dualism, but then they act that out in practice, then we've got to get to the level of the unity of theory and practice, and actually act out, what we're thinking, and vice versa. Mm-hmm. But this is good though, in terms of specifically what you're describing there, of if we continue thinking universe as a machine, right? Whether we're thinking about it as a clockwork, whether we're going to think about it as a computer, whatever the external metaphors are that are inspired by whatever technology is currently being developed. And then the mind as the observer of that machine. To me, that was somehow related to what you're talking about as the difference between even the Judeo-Christian notions of God as as the creator of the universe versus what you were saying about Whitehead's God as a sort of co-creator subject in creativity. And maybe we could go a little bit into those distinctions of how Whitehead's God differs from traditional conceptions of God. But also, I'd be really interested to know a little bit more about that mega word that was apparently maybe the title of your book originally, which is basically I'm going to call it the Segallian Trinity, or maybe not. We don't need to put your name on it, but the cosmo-theandric Trinity, like the relationship between the cosmos, God, and human. And maybe in particular the way in which you start out the prologue in relationship to claiming that a vision of that Trinity is, quote, the lies an open secret at the heart of things. Which I'm assuming, based on sort of the opening, is an open secret relating to a more participatory understanding of our thought.
Yeah. I'm so tempted to just read what Panekar says, but because I can't say it better.
We'll call it the Panekar Trinity then.
Yeah, I was just gonna say it's definitely borrowing much from him. But reality from the Cartesian point of view, or from the predominant theological point of view, where God is imagined as something separate from the created universe, reality is conceived of as a kind of dead thing, as a kind of entity that's just there, that we're not involved in so much. Though, when you start to reflect on that, that's obviously problematic. We have to be part of reality, but we imagine it as something that we could observe from the outside and understand, like a distant God separate from the universe could understand creation. And so the whole of Cartesian epistemology is just a analog of that kind of theology, right? And so to change our epistemology, we have to change our theology. They go hand in hand. And Whitehead's understanding of the divine and the God-world relationship is often termed panentheistic, not just pantheistic, where God and the world are identical, like Spinoza is often called a pantheist. I know Spinozists will quibble with that, but the idea in Spinoza, Deus sive natura, whether we call it God or nature, this infinite substance is everything that exists, and we are modes within that for Spinoza. Now for Whitehead, he's not thinking in terms of substances anymore. He's thinking in terms of processes. And so he's throwing God and the world into a co-creative process. And so panentheism is an apt phrase to use here. I think a German theologian developed that, whose name's escaping me, in the late 19th century. But there's also a term I coined in my dissertation, which is just a sort of play on words here, but instead of panentheism, it's pangentheism. Genesis, in other words, which is creation. And so, Whitehead's not just saying that God is in the world, and the inverse, that the world is in God in some sense, which is a kind of Kabbalistic insight, that God had to make room within God's self to create the world because there's something outside of God. But Whitehead's also saying that there's this creative process underway whereby God is affected by and changed by the world. That's a extremely heretical thought in the West and in Islam. The idea of God has always been as an unmoved mover. So there's a one-way flow of activity here, where God creates, and then we as creatures should love God, but God's not really affected by what we do, which from a strictly biblically literalist point of view, I mean, Yahweh gets pretty angry a lot. And so there seems to be some affect on display there. But nonetheless, in the high theology of the church, God's imagined as totally impassive. And Whitehead's saying, no, not only is God not impassive, God's not just eternal. There is an eternal aspect of God in Whitehead's philosophy, but God's also growing with the world. God's suffering with the world. And in some ways, this is a profoundly incarnational vision. And so there are elements within Christianity that Whitehead resonates with quite deeply. He totally rejects the divine dictator idea of God separate from the world, but he really does embrace this idea of God incarnate in the world, suffering with the world. But Whitehead's God is a creature of creativity. Creativity is the ultimate for Whitehead. God is the primordial creature of creativity, but nonetheless a creature. And as primordial, God's role in relationship to all the other creatures, finite creatures, let's say, is to provide this initial aim, Whitehead says, or initial eros, to use the Platonic term from the Symposium, which is this way that this eternal or primordial part of the divine provides a picture of perfection, or a kind of base note that all finite creatures can then improvise on. And then Whitehead also has this other pole of the divine nature that he calls the consequent nature of God, which is how God responds to, and how God feels and responds to, the ways that all the finite creatures improvise upon this primordial base note that was struck. But it's one God, and it's very, actually quite difficult to logically understand how this eternal pole of the divine nature and this evolving, growing pole of the divine nature fit together. It requires a flexibility of thought, a kind of polar logic, which I try to develop in the book. But it's more of an experiential insight than it is something that can be logically understood. It's a bit like the Trinity in that sense. How do these two aspects of God fit together? But we do have these intuitions of an eternal part of the divine by which we judge not only our moral actions, but our aesthetic experiences. You know, we need some standard. And Whitehead is saying the primordial nature can provide that standard, but at the same time, God is changed by what happens. We have this human need, this deep longing for communion with this being, in a way that this being would be enough like us that we could understand and relate to them. And so, how do you reconcile these two intuitions? Whitehead's theology is an attempt to do that. I often like to say that the primordial nature of God is more like this cosmological principle that accounts for the intricate order that's displayed in the natural world. And then the consequent nature of God is more like this, it's the anthropological side. It's when we try to understand the nature of the human being and what we need to feel like our experience is meaningful, we need something like this consequent nature of God, this responsive part of the divine that suffers with us and so on. And so there's the cosmological and the anthropological part of the divine nature, which again draws us back into this cosmo-theandric mystery, that you can't understand any of these big ideas independent of one another.
Yeah, there's a lot there in terms of where to pick up with that. I think that the thing that's sort of sticking out to me is also, I think, something that you found challenging, which is this paradox of God being changed by the world as well, and you know, making a distinction sort of between God as an unmoved mover, sort of distant from the world, created the world, but then, you know, that was actually the image of God that I first had in my mind when I was like 18, 19, investigating some of these questions in the literature for the first time, I had that image of God as an unmoved mover, distant from the world, and things like this. But what I wanted to sort of connect it to was, when you're saying Whitehead's God is growing with the world, suffering with the world, affected by the world, I wanted to connect it actually to the way you end this book. I'm always interested in the way people end the book, end a book, because usually you have like this profound send off, and I think it was no different with this book, where sort of the ending of the book gave me a sense of midwifery, like that that God's being born, and like that we're going through that our co-creative process, collectively, is, it seemed like the challenge is not to think about God. Well, the exact quote is not to think about God as dead and dying, but as being born, like as a, and how do you relate to that concept now? And where was that? Maybe first, where did that idea first come from for you, and where are you with that idea?
Yeah, I mean, part of this is coming out of Schelling's theology, and that he first deeply articulates and then continues to develop, but first articulates in his book, Philosophical Investigations into the Essence of Human Freedom, which was 1809. He publishes that. And then in Ages of the World, where there were many manuscripts and he never actually finished it, and then in his later Philosophy of Mythology, he's trying to understand this process whereby through the history of humanity and the history of myth, God is actually being born within human consciousness. And Schelling has a much more kind of esoteric, hermetic way of articulating this than Whitehead, who is describing it in a more, I think, conceptually rigorous way. But the idea here is that God needs human beings, that human beings can accomplish something that God cannot. I mean, the very idea that God can't. There's a whole book by an open and relational theologian, Thomas Ord, called God Can't, that I think gets the point across quite clearly. God needs human beings to achieve something that God couldn't do. And what is that? I mean, if you're an infinite, eternal being, love doesn't require you to risk anything. If you're a mortal creature and you die, to love despite that fact, I think, becomes far more meaningful, because you're actually risking the entirety of your existence, and you're loving despite the fact that you will die. You're loving despite the fact that whoever you're loving will die. And that might open up into some form of immortality, perhaps, but you can't get there unless you accept the finitude of your existence and love anyway. And so there's something about this relationship between love and death, and our freedom to choose love despite death, that I think is already there, kind of implicit in so much of the world's religions. It's definitely, I think, a profound part of the meaning of the incarnation in Christianity. But you see it also in Buddhism, I think, where there's this kind of correspondence between the realization that, okay, life is suffering. Suffering is a result of grasping. If you can let go of grasping, then out of the suffering, passion, comes compassion. And so there's this similar movement, I think, in Buddhism, and you see this in different religions, right? So I don't think it's unique to Christianity, though I don't think it's an accident that, Whitehead, despite for a time being kind of atheist earlier in his life, comes back to some of these Christian symbols in order to articulate this deeper aspect of his theology, that God needs human beings to create this deeper form of love that couldn't exist without death. And I tried, just try to hint at that in the conclusion, just to re-enliven our sense of religiosity and the importance of these sorts of symbols for human culture and being together as human beings, and how we cope with our mortality, because there are a lot of ways to react against mortality and to deny death that I think lead to a lot of social problems.
Yeah, it's interesting the way religion and philosophy interact in your work. And on that sort of note, towards I think it was in chapter 4 of your work, you talk about liturgizing Schelling and Whitehead. Again, sort of like this overlap between philosophy and religion. And so I would just ask, how does that work in your mind? How do you see the relationship or the interaction between philosophy and theology? And do you take an approach to religion which is denominational, or how do you approach religion in that regard?
I'm committed to pluralism on this front, which for me doesn't mean that I don't have commitments. I don't know, commitment doesn't feel like quite the right word, though. What I mean is, it doesn't mean that I am not, that I haven't found myself oriented better by certain traditions than others. But I am a committed pluralist in the sense that I want to learn as much as I can from people who walk other paths, because I'm convinced that we can arrive at these insights from multiple directions. And I'm not a relativist about this, though. I think, there's a certain ethics of interreligious dialogue that compels me to want to understand those who have what appears to be initially a different in perspective, a different faith, religion, spiritual perspective. Something compels me to want to engage them in dialogue and understand what that difference is all about. And in many cases, I will learn more about my own perspective and orientation. But in other cases, it might be that I feel like there's something missing in someone else's point of view. So I wouldn't be afraid to, have that difficult conversation. I think it's essential that we're willing and able to disagree with each other while not allowing those disagreements to lead to violence or dehumanization, or to judge others, but just to be able to nonetheless articulate why we think a particular perspective out contextualizes another perspective, right? So maybe this is like an agonistic pluralism, if you want. I'm not afraid to get in there and wrestle with others about these ideas. It's really important that we do wrestle with each other about these ideas, and I think we can create cultural forms to allow us to do that in a way that's mutually enhancing, and that, like good sport, where everyone agrees to the rules and we compete within those rules, and everyone's excellence is increased as a result of that. Right. So yeah, agonistic. I've never thought of that phrase, agonistic pluralism, but I think I like it. I think that captures it well.
It's a good term.
Yeah. But yeah, liturgizing. I mean, I think of philosophy as a theurgical activity. It's a when we engage in this act of communion with wisdom, with Sophia, we're not just approaching something that's out there waiting for us to observe it, right? We're actually generating it through that activity of loving it or longing for it. And that kind of a participatory vision, I think, brings philosophy back to life and allows philosophy to be not just a merely mental exercise, but a way of life, a spiritual exercise in the sense that, Pierre Hadot would talk about it. And it's a exercise whereby we form ourselves as souls, but also when we do this collectively, and this is the liturgy part, when we can engage in what the Romantics called sim philosophy, we're not only forming our souls as individuals, but we're forming new worlds together. So the participatory sort of vision that I'm articulating here, and I'm a student of the chair of my dissertation here, Jacob Sherman, who edited a great volume called The Participatory Turn in the Study of Religion and Mysticism, I think, back in 2008, which sort of the number of chapters applying this participatory approach to different religious traditions and what happens when you engage in whether it's worship or ritual or theological speculation and reflection. When you do all of that in a participatory way, you're doing theurgy, you're doing God work, you're doing you're making the world more divine. And so this is one of the other ways that I think that the God-world relationship implies that God needs us in a way. And it's going back to what I said at the beginning about faith. It's not belief in dogma. It's rather an openness to the possibility that through our own intention and our own action, we can make what we have faith in true. And it's not true unless we participate. So, you could caricature this and say, well, usually we say seeing is believing, but believing is also seeing in some ways. Like, until you're open to the possibility, you're not going to even look in a certain direction in a certain way, right? So, yeah, it's kind of what I'm getting at here. And I think, this nuance hopefully will maybe invite people who have, for various developmental reasons or family reasons or social, political reasons, have either drifted away or run screaming in the opposite direction away from religion, can rediscover it as something quite natural to human existence, and that it doesn't require the sorts of dogmatic belief that many may be used to from their upbringing, but that we can re-engage with spirituality and the mystical core of religions in a way that's totally compatible with science, but also enlivens us and motivates us to make the world better.
So I love a lot of what you're saying there, and I resonate with a lot of that personally. I like the term that you're developing, agonistic pluralism. I do think that if we have a pluralism without the agony, or a pluralism without the tension, that there are problems there, and you articulated what those problems are very well. So I appreciated that immensely. Also, the metaphor of sports is something that's come up in some dialogues I've had before, and I resonate with that myself, because in part, I think that my original drive was a drive to sports, and when that failed, it just transitioned into philosophy, or transitioned into science. It just, I'm
Same
taking
for
the
me.
same for you, right? So I actually think it's a great thing. I think it's a great thing for many different reasons, and in the sense that a lot of like the discipline and skills that you build in sports can be just transferred, sublimated over to academics. But also there's a certain thirst and a certain desire there, that you cultivate and have a bodily contact within sports, which, is, I think, sometimes lacking in some academic spaces. So it's nice to sort of bring that vibe back, and like, and not in like like in a respectful way, like in the way that sometimes in the way that great athletes do compete with each other, but in a way that I often see with like martial artists, sort of like the mutual respect that they have for each other, even in training, with like you almost, there's something noble and honorable about like someone bringing you to the point of, I could kill you right now, but I'm not going to, you know, and vice versa. Like, and just being close to that and being in touch with that. It's very interesting. And also what you were saying about believing is seeing, I think that's super interesting as well. I think that functions a lot in the politico-theological space in general, like, you know, like that
it's problematic too, but I'm
it's
just saying that,
it's
you know, on
super
some level,
problematic. No, totally it's a double-edged
we
sword.
don't want to do it uncritically, but we can't
Yeah,
just throw out the baby with the bathwater, you know.
yeah, no, that's something that I've had experience. That there's, I won't go into the story, but there was an important moment in my life where I came to that conclusion, that don't throw out the baby with the bath. That seemed to resonate with me very strongly too. Um, and also, you know, religion is natural is another thing that I think is an important point, and something that was totally missed until recently in the evolutionary literature. Now we have it more commonly expressed, right? Like, I'm thinking about Darwin's Cathedral, the book by David Sloan Wilson,
Yeah, group
as a,
selection.
yeah, and that's important. But I do want to hold you to the question of liturgizing Schelling and Whitehead in regards to, what do you mean by that? And I want to say, like, I want to contextualize this in relationship to what other people I've talked to recently have said. I collaborate with a I guess he calls himself a pyrotheologist. His name's Peter Rollins. You can see there's some conversations we've had on my channel. But he is working on creating a liturgy for pyrotheology, which is deeply informed by philosophy. And so I'm just saying that I've seen that come up, you know, this idea that we need to liturgize philosophy. And that, you know, at least from my readings and what I think's at stake here, because I do think there are stakes, is also something that's pointed to in the end of your book, in regards to Deleuze. So I'll just quote that specifically, is that we should compare philosophical religion to Deleuze's call to an imminent spiritual practice motivated by worldly renewal, basically, instead of the afterlife. So, like, instead of having religions that are dedicated towards your immortal soul is going to be preserved in the afterlife, that we liturgize philosophy in the sense of an imminent spiritual practice motivated by worldly renewal. And I think this is a super important conversation that requires many different angles, perspectives. So I'm interested to get your point of view here.
Yeah, in attempting to liturgize, I'm trying to connect philosophy and ritual and the deeper meaning of ritual as a reenactment or participation in a sacred deed of some kind. And also to you know, part of what I do in the epilogue is chastise Deleuze a bit, drawing on Isabel Stenger's, actually, to say that sometimes he's a little too quick to jettison common sense, and that there is value in being understood by non-philosophers, and so religious liturgy is a way of drawing a community of fellow worshipers, fellow participants in the divine mystery together in a maximally inclusive way, in order to partake with one another in these rituals of reenactment, whether, you know, it's Eucharist, which can often be construed as just a Catholic or Christian ritual, but it actually far predates the Catholic Church, and just to recognize that there are very simple facts about our shared existence on the planet that have profound religious significance. Just, you know, like the fact that life has to eat other life, and that in some sense we all belong to one body. and these, basic images that are part of communion and the Eucharist. And I think to be able to emphasize the immediacy of these facts and to really be able to experience them together allows us to forge a whole new kind of collective life together. And yeah, the emphasis on worldly renewal is really important, I think, as a check on the obsession with afterlife that has come to characterize so many forms of Christianity nowadays, where so many people are just waiting for heaven. And what happens on the earth is not important. This is a staging ground or a test or whatever. And that we only have this one opportunity to pass the test, this one life. And that all that matters is whether or not we pass the test and whether we go to heaven or hell. And this, there is this anthropological need I said before of like the responsiveness of God to our own activity. And this is one way that this can manifest, is that we want to be chosen to go to heaven. And that idea of what human life is all about, that idea of the soul, I think is very short-sighted. And one way of understanding, like Whitehead's process relational ontology, in the sense that, what we call the human soul is actually what he would call a historical root of actual occasions of experience that are intimately related to one another. But from moment to moment of our life history, we're never the same twice. I'm not the same person I was as an infant, or as a teenager, or etc. There is continuity here. There is a sense of personal character, of course, that develops. We can recognize one another from our behavior, often from our looks, but not always. There is continuity of character, but there's also continual recreation from moment to moment, or you could even say reincarnation. So, instead of just thinking of reincarnation as, well, lifetime to lifetime, some kind of essence or spirit or soul moves from body to body, Whitehead's ontology is in some sense reincarnational, just in the sense that moment by moment we are, each occasion of experience is inheriting a past, but being reincarnated in the present with an injection of novelty, and trying to, in a way, make amends for what happened in the past. Each moment of experience is this aesthetic achievement that takes what was fragmentary in the past and tries to congeal it, compress it, harmonize it into a satisfying picture, a satisfying experience or sense of self-enjoyment. And so, this whole reading of a process of karmic inheritance and reincarnation and stuff, I think it actually serves as a helpful touch point for understanding Whitehead's whole ontology. But we could extend that further, and I think, and this isn't something I developed so much in this book as one of the ways that I've tried to carry forward this work a little bit, is to talk about the ethics of reincarnation as an alternative to this single incarnation idea that dominates among religious believers. And then, of course, there's the sort of atheist materialist view that we just life is and consciousness is just extinguished, and it's as though we never even existed when we die. I think increasingly large numbers of people believe that, and then you get the extreme afterlife visions of another sector of society. Both of these are profoundly, I think, unhelpful and lead to they have social and political and economic consequences, right? So these religious ideas really matter, and I include the atheist materialist view as a religious idea. I mean, you can't help it. You can't help but be religious on these questions about what happens when we die. But I think reincarnation affords us an alternative view which could help with ecological issues that we all as human beings are inheriting the achievements of a 4.5 billion year evolutionary process of biological evolution on this planet. It gives us more of a sense of responsibility to inherit well what came before us, all that suffering, but also all that was achieved to make us who and what we are. And also when we think about the future, it's one thing to just think about your own immediate children and offspring, but if there is this reincarnational process, it's like even centuries from now, we will still be here. There is no out, there is no escape from this process, this profoundly collective process of deep relationship that we're all in with each other. And so, I'm exploring just as a speculative hypothesis. I don't remember my past lives and, not claiming anything like that. But as a speculative hypothesis, given that no one can see before their own birth and no one can see after their own death, at least directly, we have to speculate about these things. I think reincarnation provides us with some potent ethical intuitions that we can then live into and see how the world is transfigured as a result.
Again, lots to say there. I mean, I think that the first thing that's coming to my mind is a type of dialectical opposition that I feel like you're articulating in regards to on the one hand, the atheist materialist point of view. When my granddad passed away a few years ago, and I would always talk with him, go down and chat with my granddad, and he would always just say, "When you're dead, you're dead." That was his. Should just repeat that every. I'd always ask him. He used to say, "When you're dead, you're dead." On the other hand, I have a grandmother in Wales. We would discuss these things, and she had the exact opposite point of view. That she knew for sure there was a heaven, and she knew for sure she was gonna see me when we were both dead, and she was for sure gonna tell me "I told you so" as soon as I go in. So I feel like even my grandparents in this, they were on opposite sides of the family, but my grandparents in these two extremes are this extreme. This, on the one hand, the atheist materialist point of view. And my granddad's situation was coming from being raised in a very strict Catholic upbringing as a child, and he had a reaction against that. And then my grandmother's point of view, more like this dogmatic afterlife is for sure real, and that's the truth, and so forth. And so it's interesting to think about a culture, what happens to a culture when we get caught between these two extremes, and at the same time trying to articulate an alternative window or vision or approach to these things, which it at the end of the day, it's you can't get more personal, can you? Because it's about the fate of you and the fate of us. So it's interesting, but I think it's very interesting to think about this limit case that you're bringing up, and it's something that I think it's so fundamental to the way I've tried to be thinking as well, is that no one can see before their death. No one can see before their own birth, and no one can see after their own death. And it's interesting, this as a sort of like fundamental limit case of the human being, and instead, not saying that Kant's phenomena divide isn't very interesting and obviously very thought-provoking, but seems like this limit case needs philosophical attention as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. And a lot of my attention more recently has been directed at this problem. Because it's like, I was talking earlier about the relationship between death and love, but I think there's a similar relationship between birth and love. A sexual act is required for fertilization to occur.
Is that how it happens?
I think so.
I'm joking.
So like, we're welcomed into and out of the world through love, at least in some ideal sense, right? Not all sexual acts are expressions of love, at least in the deeper sense. And not all of us can face death in ourselves or in others lovingly. But I think that's the opportunity, the invitation is to do so. And when we do cultivate that, I mean, I was talking about a cardiocentric philosophy or heart-centered philosophy, not just a mind or cognicentric philosophy. And if we can begin to perceive with our hearts, I think a new sort of vision might be possible that builds a kind of a bridge for us between lives, between one another as we coexist right now, but also temporally, that my ego can't remember, a prior life, and I can't see the future beyond the death of this body, but that's using my intellect and my eyeballs. And I think we do have other perceptual capacities that we have not in our in modern Western civilization been encouraged to develop. And I think that love is not just a sentiment. It's not just an animal instinct. It's potentially an organ of perception. But until, like artists, in order to perceive shape and color, have to really train for a long time before a painter can create a beautiful painting, or a sculptor, create a beautiful sculpture. We need to first accept that it's possible that we could perceive with the heart, and then it's going to take a lot of work to actually exercise that muscle to the point that it can work well. So it's not just flipping a switch, right? But I think we've just been so discouraged from taking this kind of an idea seriously that very few people have ever made the effort to do that work. But I think it's never too late to start. And I do think results begin to I'm at the beginning of that sort of work myself, but I think results show pretty quickly. So there's payoff immediately. You don't have to wait for, to do this contemplative work for decades, and then the veil drops and all of a sudden you're in the new world. It doesn't work like that. It's a gradual process, but you do see results just in the way that new conversations become possible, which leads to eventually, new sorts of associations, new sorts of institutions, and then we're off and running,
That's the fundamental dimension of the problem as far as I see it. And it's bringing, and also you expressed this very well, I think, in regards to the distinction between learning to see with the heart versus working it as a muscle. And that's why I'm always a little skeptical of people who tell me about their immediate conversion experiences, like where just like one moment I'm not with God, next moment I'm with God, and now, work's done. It's like, I'm always like, I'm not so sure. I don't know. You tell me that, it's okay. But I'm much more sort of sympathetic with this idea of the work of the heart. Now, as it relates to the work of the heart and the new associations and the new institutions, this is the whatever price tag question you want to say, it's higher than that,
Yeah.
The $1 trillion question, probably higher than that, since $1 billion isn't what it used to be, and soon $1 trillion isn't going to be what it used to be. So yeah, no, this is really where everything sort of hits, where everything hits the core, where theology and politics and economy and anthropology and sociology all collide in a big mix. and what's a bigger mess today than our contemporary politics and economy and all that. And so to me, these are not only imminent, transcendental religious questions, they're imminent practical political economic questions.
Mm-hmm.
Of even, it might be not even about thriving but surviving at one point, on some level. But
Mm-hmm.
I guess that's connected to the last question I wanted to ask from the epilogue, which is, I like the way you talk about the relationship between the cosmos and the anthropos as God's primordial. Cosmos is God's primordial nature,
Mm-hmm.
and anthropos is God's consequent nature, or God's becoming. And the reason why I think that's an interesting sort of last question is not only because it's a profound question, but also because it's, I think, so deeply connected to what you were talking about with working the heart muscle and building new associations and institutions in this way. It seems to
Mm-hmm.
be directly connected to this cosmos and anthropos relation, maybe.
Mm. Yeah. Politically, I identify as a kind of anarchist, right? Which is not to say I don't think there's a divine order to things, but if God is in relationship to this ongoing co-creative process, then there's a kind, I mean, Whitehead uses this phrase, there's a kind of anarchy at the heart of things, because ultimately God's aim is at intensity of experience and the increase in beauty. And beauty is the maximization of diversity held under contrast or in harmony. And so that's what God's seeking, and God needs our help to achieve that maximal harmony. And we're so tempted by old religious forms to imagine that, if we just got the government to the right people in the government, then that institution could save us. Or, if we just let the market actually be free, then those institutions would save us. Or, some people increasingly now think we should revamp theocracies, and if only the church were given the power it used to have, then everything would be great. I think there are deep, important impulses behind the founding of all of these institutions. And, Bergson in Two Sources of Morality and Religion would describe the founding figures of religions as kind of like the hot magma that just pours out from the center of the earth. And everyone just feels illuminated by its warmth and its light. And then as that original founder dies, then it's like the magma solidifying into rock, and you end up with these encrusted dead forms where nobody really knows why we're doing it this way anymore. It's just how it's always been done, and institutions decay in this way. And I think actually, even though I have anarchist sympathies, I don't think institutions are dispensable. We absolutely need institutions. And I think the kind of institutions we have now could work. And the challenge isn't that we need total revolution and reconstruction, like in the spirit of, the French revolutionaries who wanted to just reconstruct everything from first principles or whatever, new calendar, new holidays, all of this. It's like, that's not going to work. We're historical beings, and we need continuity. But I think with the right attitude and the right heart-centered form of action and engagement with one another, we can actually revitalize the existing institutions. Not necessarily in their exact forms. I mean, we might need to, for example, in the American context, in the United States, rethink electoral college, details like this that maybe aren't as relevant hundreds of years after the Constitution was first framed. But the general idea of, distinguishing between these spheres of activity, like an economy and a government and culture. And, here I'm drawing on Rudolf Steiner, who I think with in this book quite a bit. We didn't bring him up yet, but he has this idea of the threefold social order, whole nother conversation. But the basic idea is that over the course of human history, these three spheres of activity, each with its own inherent dignity, has arisen and differentiated itself. They're not separate, but they are differentiated, right? There's the economy, government, and culture, which includes everything from religion to sports to science to education and so on. And there's core values that each of these spheres tries to uphold, and the original impulse in founding each of them needs to be remembered for the institutions to function effectively. So the cultural sphere is all about freedom. The economic sphere is all about meeting human needs and recognizing the metabolism of the earth and the way that we are bound up in that metabolism. And the political sphere, the sphere of governance, is about equal rights, protecting the equality of human beings. But a lot of the problems, I think, in our current time have to do with the unhealthy merger of one sphere with another. So, to speak in very simple terms, neoliberal capitalism is the economic sphere dominating government and culture. So culture gets all commodified. Legislation is purchased by corporations, basically, right? So this is a overemphasis on the economic sphere. Communism, state communism, would be an overemphasis of the political sphere that micromanages the economy and controls culture and so on. And fascism would be when the cultural sphere, the particular form of cultural ideology, dominates over the economy and government, right? And so we want to avoid. You could see how in the modern period there's been this extremism where, in an attempt to, I guess, think consistently, different political movements, different ideological movements have arisen and overemphasize one sphere over another. And the aim, in Steiner's view, would be for free, wise, compassionate human beings to recognize that we each have a role to play in each of these spheres, and to allow that differentiation to exist, respecting the freedom of people spiritually to engage in artistic creation and religious worship and scientific inquiry, free of state control and free of economic profit motives interfering with all of that free expression. And in the economy, rather than having so much of the energy being poured into creating new human desires, to really just focus on meeting human needs. That's what the economy should be focused on: food, shelter. And that there's going to be interplay between like science and basic research and the sorts of instruments and technologies that can be used economically to meet human needs more efficiently and so on. But yeah, the idea would be, from the basic starting point, that we are each free individuals, to be able to engage in associations and in the social organism by recognizing the unique dignities of these different spheres, which have naturally differentiated over time. I think it's a kind of anarchist vision, in the sense that the government politics would, in the context of like the US again, would be dramatically downsized. The government's doing all sorts of things that, in Steiner's view, it shouldn't be doing. But it would focus on its primary purpose, which is to protect the rights of people and to make sure that we're all equal under the law. And sometimes that means different cultural groups might have different courts because, their ways of judging certain things are different. But at the end of the day, I think Steiner would want to protect individual rights, even in cases where there were some culture. This is the agonistic part of pluralism. There are some cultures now where the idea of individual rights isn't really a thing. And that would be a problem that needs to be worked out. So this isn't like a full solution to the world's problems, but I think it's a way forward. But all of it stems from, human beings being able to, cultivate this heart muscle and this new center of gravity, so that we're not off balance and living in a kind of materialistic nightmare on the one hand, or thinking of life as just this temporary thing, and really we want to find the escape route into heaven. This is another emphasis on, well, how do we renew the world together in the most loving and wise way that we can.
Fantastic. I could say a lot, but I'll just leave it with I really appreciated the distinctions you're making there triadically between neoliberal capital, state communism, and fascism. I thought that was really clear and succinct and accurate in my view as well. And I guess for the listeners, I just bring it back around to that point that, you know, you've been circulating for the last 20 minutes about the heart muscle and exercising that, and that has consequences for political economy and culture and whatever associations, institutions, maybe networks that might emerge around that. Certainly in line with, I think, the work I'm trying to do and the networks I'm trying to engage in. And so in that sense, I'm, you know, very, very, very sympathetic to this vision. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to invite you on, because I pick up Crossing the Threshold. I thought this was a very informative book. I was not as well versed in Schelling and Whitehead as I am now. So I just want to thank you a lot for your work and for this conversation. I would just ask, is there anything that you'd want to, a final thought you'd like to leave the viewers with, or also further information about where they can find your work if they want to explore it deeper?
I just want to thank you for inviting me and asking such great questions, and yeah, to really encourage people who don't already do this. I assume if they're watching this and you know, have been enjoying the content you're putting out, then they already do this. But have these conversations with family and friends. Just bring these ideas up, whether it's the questions about what happens when we die, or you know, the role that a different heart-centered attitude to life might play. We need to talk to each other about these things in a serious way. It might be the most important thing we can do. I mean, there's a lot of like technical problems and big geopolitical struggles and all of these things, but it might actually, the solutions to a lot of that might actually start much closer to home. So I'd encourage people to just talk to each other about these things. And yeah, I have a website, footnotes-to-plato.com, numeral 2, where folks can keep up with my work.
Fantastic. And if you are going to have these conversations, perhaps some background in Schelling and Whitehead will help. So I'd encourage everyone again to pick up Crossing the Threshold. And thanks so much to Dr. Segall for joining me. For everyone who's been listening, thank you so much and have a great evening.